I'm Dr. Brett Osborn, board-certified neurosurgeon, nutrition specialist, and featured BPI sports expert.
So one thing that I tell people, but coming from you, coming from an expert, coming from a doctor, I think it gives it a lot more credibility. One thing that I tell people, I said, look, and this goes back to the beginning of our conversation. I said, your weight loss benefits, your fat loss benefits aren't coming from the ketones. They're coming from being in a low carb state.
Really, James, let me interrupt you for 1 second. Let's distill that down even further. It's really about the insulin signaling. I don't even care about the carbohydrates.
Right.
If you are in a low carbohydrate state, you are in a low insulin state. And when you're in a low insulin state, that's what's going to confer health and longevity, period.
Right.
These diseases are all diseases, stroke, heart attack, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease. They're all the byproduct of a high insulin state, which is an inflammatory state. You can call them whatever you want. In my mind, and arthritis is in there too. Call it whatever you want. All of these diseases are the same disease.
So not from a health perspective, but from a body composition perspective, explain to people how insulin works and that when your insulin levels are high, what's happening. So let's say, for example, I eat a meal that's high in fat, high in dietary fat, and also high in sugar. So I get this insulin response. So explain to people what insulin actually does.
Right. Insulin is a vascular protectant, as far as I'm concerned. High levels of insulin tell the body, bring sugar in to the cells and utilize it for energy. Any excess is stored as fat. Insulin's an anabolic hormone. It builds muscle and it builds fat. It builds both. So we live in America, we live with high simple carbohydrate consumption, high levels of insulin, and by virtue of that, anything that is excessive, so outstrips the body's demand for it. So if you're not running around like Michael Phelps, as an example, burning 10,000 calories a day, anything else is going to be, any excess carbohydrate is going to be stored as fat under the influence of insulin. Under the influence of insulin, excess carbohydrates are stored as fat.
And that's why someone described once to me insulin simply as the storage hormone.
It is a storage hormone, okay?
So signaling either like bodybuilders praise insulin for its anabolic properties,
right,
as just as a signal, right? Like you were saying, or on the flip side, it's also what can make us gain fat.
The bottom line is that it's an anabolic hormone. It's a storage hormone, as James had said. The problem is that we are having, and we here are exposed to very, very heightened levels of insulin, excess insulin. These diseases are diseases of excess insulin. But hang on a second. It's not the insulin itself that really is the offender. And James had alluded to this before. It's really the carbohydrate, the excess carbohydrate, simple carbohydrate consumption that does the damage. So when you eat a simple carbohydrate and your sugar spikes through the roof, your blood sugar, if you were to test it, just let's say after a meal it goes to 200, what are you doing what is happening to your vascular system as the sugar is going north? And what's happening to your vascular system, and I've scratched this wall about 10,000 times, but here's what happens. That's really annoying, right? And I do that because I'm showing people that sugar, and this again is a simplified version, is literally scratching the lining of your blood vessels. And when there's damage to the inside of the blood vessels, there's inflammation. And when there's inflammation, there's a response that's mounted. And the upshot of that response is cholesterol deposition in the lining of the arteries. And you keep eating all these sugars and have high levels of insulin to tell the body, hey, get the sugar inside the cell, clear it from the blood vessels, bring it in. What ends up happening is that you overload the system.
It almost becomes white noise in the body.
That's exactly right. It is white noise. Now remember, when you have high levels of sugar, okay, in the bloodstream, because you've developed insulin resistance, not only do you have this circulating growth factor that's sitting there, insulin, it's the storage hormone, it grows things. Not only does it grow fat, what else is it growing? It's growing cancers. Let me ask you a question. When you inject, you've all heard of a PET scan, right? So
a what?
A PET scan. It's how we search for cancer in the body.
Okay.
It's a radionucleotide test, okay, radionuclide test. So it has to do with injecting a radio-labeled molecule, and that molecule, which is radio-labeled, goes to the cancers. And you can find cancers. What do you think the radio-labeled molecule is that we inject? What do you think we inject? Well, glucose, right? So when you live in a low glucose state, a low insulin state, You are anti-cancering yourself. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
Fat, cancer cells do not use fat for energy. There's something called the Warburg effect. I'm sure you're familiar.
So high carbohydrate diet, you're potentially feeding disease.
Not potentially.
You are.
With 100% certainty, you are feeding disease. So if you do the opposite and you live in a low insulin state, the low carbohydrate state, I'm not saying starve yourself.
Right.
Does your body think it's starving when it's on an Atkins diet or a modified ketogenic diet?
At first,
yes.
yeah.
No, it always does. Because you are in a low insulin state.
Right.
So when you are starved, you are in a low insulin state. Drugs like metformin.
So does it always feel that way, or does at some point your body adapt to it?
Hold on. It doesn't feel that way, but it is that way. So in other words, you don't feel, oh my God, I'm starving. As a matter of fact, the patients on my modified diet, what did we say about the traditional ketogenic diet? Are people starving? No.
Right.
Their appetite is suppressed, almost to the point where I don't like it because I have to tell them, you better eat, otherwise you are going to sacrifice some muscle. So we want to keep people in a low insulin state, but they have a satiety signal.